Would you get out your Bibles? 2 Corinthians chapter 9, verses 1 through 6. However you need to get to your Bible, and we're going to be going through this together today in this series that we're looking at 2 Corinthians chapter 8 and 9 on contagious generosity, today on giving bountifully. I'm going to begin by reading verse 1 to you again. But I'm going to use the Greek word order, and I'm going to use one English word for each Greek word that shows up, because all the English translations really use a different order than what shows up in the Greek translation. So if I were just going to have a Greek Bible and open it up and start at word 1 and go to the end of those Greek words, it would read like this. For indeed, about this service to the saints, more for me is to write to you. That sounds quite a bit different than the NIV's. There is no need for me to write to you about this service to the Lord's people. It even sounds very different to the New American Standard Version, which I tend to like, which translates Paul's words, for it is superfluous for me to write to you about this ministry to the saints. The term for more that Paul used, saying he wanted to talk more, is the same one that shows up in John 10:10 as abundant, where Jesus said, the thief has come only to steal and kill and destroy. I came that they may have life and have it abundantly, to have life and have it more. Paul had already spent what we designate as a whole chapter talking about this matter of collecting an offering to relieve the fellow believers who were suffering from the famine in Judea. And yet Paul begins this chapter by saying, I still have more to write to you about it. It's the equivalent of us saying, I'm not finished yet. I know you think you've heard enough, but I've got more to tell you. Before we begin our study of this more that Paul had to say, I'll remind you that the people who Paul was writing to were pretty affluent in Corinth, which is about 940 miles away from Judea, which back then would have taken you weeks, even if you were trying to get there quickly. Corinth was very different, not just in separation from mileage, but they were different in that Corinth was affluent, where those in Judea were not. Corinth was enjoying an abundance where those back in Judea were not. Corinth was no hint of hard times. They were sort of living in the bubble. Not so in Judea. Corinth was well assimilated into the Roman culture. And in Judea, they were still rebelling against Rome. It makes you wonder what else Paul could say to those believers that he hadn't already said that would get them in Corinth to really get to the point of actually doing something about this need in Judea. There were no photos for him to send, no videos, no internet updates, the kinds of things that often spur us on. The only word they had was the word of someone who'd been in Judea and they'd seen it firsthand. And they were back telling others, we got to do something about this, which is why Paul was sending some their way to remind them again of that suffering, people who had seen it for themselves. If you recall from our study of chapter 8, when Paul first talks to the believers in Corinth about the need of their brothers and sisters in Judea, it had moved them out of compassion to do something. They were shocked to learn that the synagogues through whom the official relief efforts were being administered were not being passed along to anyone who was a believer, because anyone who was a believer had been cast out of the synagogues, and so they weren't receiving any help at all. And Paul had concluded, says, hey, if these guys are going to get any help, it's going to be up to the church. We're going to have to take care of our own. What Christian would not be moved to help if you heard a story like that? And as we've learned in our study, these believers in Corinth had not, at the time of this letter that Paul was writing, actually done anything to get beyond their being moved about it. What more could Paul tell them that might get them from the thinking about it to the doing? these believers in Corinth were not the only ones, or even the last believers, to say that they really wanted to help with something, but never got around to actually offering any help. Like Steve's illustration, there were not many little boys saying, "Here, take my lunch." They were just saying, giving them my lunch would be a good idea. In Baltimore's Morning Herald on January 2nd, 1888, and you heard that right, 1888, there was an article that was run in the headline, and it was titled, "Better Pay Old Vows." The story was about a preacher, Reverend Wayland D. Ball. He was the pastor of the Associate Reformed Presbyterian Church, who began a New Year's sermon saying that we ought to use New Year's Day not to make more resolutions, but we ought to use New Year's Day to make a commitment to actually do the resolutions from last year that we didn't do. I don't know how. I'm like, what a great way to celebrate New Year's Day. Let's do what we said we were going to do. His sermon read this way in part, trying to make that point. We make some resolution of self-sacrifice, and then we become happy over thinking about how brave we are going to be and how good we are going to become. But the contemplation of what we are going to do is so much more pleasant and easy than performance, that we become content with having contemplated. But there is no virtue in good thoughts alone. Religious emotion that comes from the mere making of vows is very often nothing more but the devil tricking us into a good humor with ourselves. The road to hell is paved with good intentions. Pastor Ball was not the first nor the last to use that phrase in hopes of shocking well-meaning Christians into actually doing the good they've contemplated. Pastor Ball could have quoted James, who tried to shock wealthy believers into helping those who did not even have the basic needs met by saying, "Faith without works is dead." Or he could have quoted John, who said, "If you say you love your brother and you seem in need and you do nothing, you're a liar. The truth is not in you." Thinking but not doing must have been a common problem in that early church. So it shouldn't come as a surprise that we find the Apostle Paul having to communicate this same message. He too made his point more than once because he did not want any misunderstanding about the kind of change that the gospel is supposed to make in a person who decides to follow Jesus. If you're really following Jesus, you're supposed to become a person who does, not just a person who thinks. People who get around to expressing the love, not just feeling it. Did you notice that in verse 2, Paul stated that he knew that the believers in Corinth were ready, or as some translations say, that they were eager. But he didn't use spudo, that word that we learned about last week. Spudo was quickly responding to someone's need, and to be honest, that just didn't describe those early believers in Corinth. The Greek word that Paul used to describe them, it is translated ready, is the word prothumia. Pro, before, thumia, passion, is the word that it literally just means for passion. That's passion that rises up in a person in advance of them responding and doing something for passion. Thumia, if you were to have it show up in the Bible by itself, the second part of this prothumia is usually translated anger. It literally means heat. It is that passion that wells up in us in advance of doing something good about something that's made us angry. Now, what we do out of anger, we often are quick to act out of that passion, often makes a mess of things. But we can get heated up with passion that leads us to do wonderful things, like Paul was challenging these Corinthians to do. We need passion in our lives. We need a little bit of heat in our lives. And the believers in Corinth, when they heard about the situation in Judea, they got heated up about it to do something about it. They were, in that sense, ready to help, but they never got past that feeling about it. Paul even boasted about their passion to the believers in Macedonia, he says in our text. The story about someone else's passion can inspire us to join the cause, can't it? When you see someone excited about it, you see they're passionate about it, you're going like, I want to go do something about that too. And Paul wanted these believers in Corinth to know that when he told their story about their passion, it had inspired others. But Paul had made the mistake of assuming that the believers in Corinth would go past the passion and on to the action. So when he was traveling around, raising funds by telling the story of their passion to believers like those in Macedonia, he admits that he had told those believers that, the believers in Corinth, they've been ready to give their funds for a whole year. And I'm talking to you, so you need to be ready too. Now, he uses the term Acacia to say they've been ready. If you don't know, Acacia was the Roman province of which Corinth was the principal city. So when Paul said and was spreading the news that Acacia was ready, he was talking about the believers in Corinth. That was before Paul heard the rest of the story. He was saying they were ready. They've been ready for a year, and he gets the news, they're not ready at all. And I've been telling everyone they're ready, using them as an example that everybody ought to follow. Man, I'm in trouble. Corinth had been passionate about sending him, but they hadn't actually collected since. Even so, Paul said, the story of their zeal inspired other believers, and these other believers, through that inspiration, had made their collections, and they were all ready to give. They are now waiting on Corinth. Paul, because he had heard that they were not ready, was afraid that the believers in Corinth would be unprepared to present their promised offering whenever it came time for Paul to show up and collect it. And Paul didn't want his boasting about them, his confidence in them, to end up bringing shame on them. That's why, as we learned last week, Paul had sent the brethren, this ministry team of Titus and Luke and that other unnamed brother, to Corinth. It was not to force them to give. It wasn't someone to come in and shake them down. It wasn't someone to shame them into giving. But it was showing up to assist them to do what they said they wanted to do. It was to help them express the very desire of their heart. There are times when we need help keeping our commitments. It is one thing to have the desire and quite another to get her done, which is probably why there's, I was trying to count on this last week, about a bazillion articles on the internet on how to get organized and get past the thinking and get to the doing. Most of the articles that I read this last week include making a list, prioritizing that list, breaking projects into smaller tasks, creating a calendar with deadlines on it, to get those individual tasks done, recruiting volunteers and having a plan of who has certain resources and how you're going to recruit them and where you're going to put them at, and putting together all of these charts and these graphs and having this great, wonderful plan, and then begin to delegating those things and managing the time it's going to take place. There's a lot of advanced work that has to happen to make a project like this giving to the saints to get to part of it getting done. Which is why I found it interesting that in verse 5 there are 3 words that begin with the prefix in advance. The in advance goes in front of go, equip, and announce. Paul's ministry trained the brethren were going in advance of his arrival to collect it so they could equip the believers in advance to make good on their announcements to help the saints, which they had made in advance. Doing things in advance rather than last minute doesn't mean that you're not passionate about doing it. It just means that your passion has been funneled through direction and organization so that you can be more effective. But even all the advanced work can sometimes get in the way. I know a lot of people who do all the planning and all the advanced stuff, and they do all the organization, but they still never get to the doing. Paul's hope was that all this advanced work would result in a bountiful gift. Bountiful, that is, if you're reading from the New American Standard Version. It's called a generous gift if you're reading from the New International Version. And a voluntary gift if you're using the New Revised Standard Version. There was enough variation between all these English translations that I decided to take a closer look at the word that they were struggling to get into English. And I'll be honest, I was a little surprised by what I found. It's the Greek word eulogia, eulogy. About the only time we hear that term eulogy used today is when we gather for a funeral, right? We offer eulogies. That is, we speak good about the person who's passed away. Eulogy literally means EU, good, logia, words. That we're going to have good words. But logia is most often translated throughout the rest of the New Testament as the word blessing. I like Paul's description of their gift as a blessing. I like it a whole lot better than bountiful or generous or voluntary. He wanted their giving to be a blessing. And we all understand what it is to bless someone. It could be that you give a blessing, you give good words because you are responding to what someone else has done for you. For example, God does good things for us, right? He knows how to get good gifts. We receive his good gifts into our lives because God is a God of doing. And we respond by eulogy. Bless the Lord, O my soul, and all that is within me. Bless his holy name. As good as it feels to be blessed by someone like God, I'll be honest, it feels even better to be the one who gets to help bless others. To be the one who gets to do something good for someone else and get that good done, and for them to say, man, that was so generous. That was such a blessing. Thank you. Paul was hoping that the Corinthians' intentions would be turned into real blessings. They're doing something good that would elicit these good words. But our efforts to bless someone, Paul points out in verse 5, can be derailed by our own desire for more, which is what the Greek word that gets translated covetousness or given grudgingly, depending on your English translation, means. Our desire for more for ourselves can get in the way. The desire for more is greed. And it can be at work in our life rather than grace. Grace is just another word for giving. We talked last week how greed got in the way of Ananias and Sapphira's desire to help last week. And this week I want to remind you of that time when there was someone in the crowd that was following Jesus. And this guy asked, "Teacher, tell my brother to divide the family inheritance with me." He would have probably been a younger brother. They didn't usually get much, if anything, under Jewish law. He didn't think it was fair. He's wanting Jesus to do something about it. And Jesus said to him, "Man, who appointed me a judge or an arbiter over you?" Now, I've always found that a little odd because Jesus is going to judge everyone at the end, right? But this is what Jesus said. And then Jesus turns to the crowd. And he says, "Beware. And be on your guard against every form of greed, for not even when one has an abundance," that same word, "does his life consist of his possessions." Then Jesus told them a parable saying, the land of a rich man was really productive. And he began reasoning to himself, saying, "What shall I do, since I have no place to store my crops?" And then he said, "This is what I'll do. I will tear down my barns and build larger ones. There I will store all my grain and my goods." Retirement planning. "And I will say to my soul, soul, you have many goods laid up for many years to come. Take your ease, eat, drink, and be merry." But God said to him, "You fool, this very night your own soul is required of you, and now who will own what you have prepared? So is the man who stores up treasure for himself and is not rich toward God." And Jesus said to his disciples, he's turning to the one man, then to the crowd, now just his disciples, talking to people who are wanting to follow Jesus. For this reason, I say to you, don't worry about your life as to what you will eat, nor your body as to what you will put on. For life is more than food, and the body more than clothing. Consider the ravens. We got a few of those around here. For they neither sow nor reap. They have no storeroom nor barn. And yet God feeds them. How much more valuable are you than the birds? And which of you, by worrying, can add a single hour to his lifespan? If then you cannot do even a very little thing, why do you worry about other matters? Consider the lilies, how they grow. They neither toil nor spin. But I tell you, not even Solomon in all of his glory clothed himself like one of these. But if God so clothes the grass in the field, which is alive today and tomorrow is thrown into the furnace, how much more will he clothe you? You men of little faith. And do not seek what you will eat or what you will drink. And do not keep worrying. For all these things the nations of the world eagerly seek. But your Father in heaven knows that you need these things. But seek his kingdom, and these things will be added to you. Don't be afraid, little flock, for your Father has chosen gladly to give you the kingdom. Sell your possessions and give to charity. Make yourselves money belts which don't wear out, an unfailing treasure in heaven, where no thief comes near nor moth destroys. And then he says the thing that we often remember. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. It was Paul's hope that the believers in Corinth would not hold back when it came to the people who were suffering in Judea. When we hold back, our offerings don't translate into the kind of blessing that it could have been if we just trusted God. Paul emphasizes this uncomfortable truth with an agricultural metaphor. He said, he who sows sparingly will reap sparingly, and he who sows a blessing will reap a blessing. If you're wondering about my translation on that last part of the verse, he's using that same word that we had earlier, and we talked about eulogia, blessing. He who sows a blessing will receive a blessing. It's true that blessing others can seem financially counterintuitive. Just as the famous fictional character that we all like to make fun of, Scrooge. And he was a miserly guy, wasn't he? He seemed to hold on to every penny he ever earned in order to get rich. I like when he gets characterized as Scrooge McDuck, and he's on that pile of gold. I mean, I just like, man, there's nobody as Scroogey as that person. He saved it all because he wanted to get rich. And in the original story, he became extremely wealthy and rich. But was all said and done, there was not a single person who would ever have come to his aid for anything. Not even his own family. They knew the truth about him. If you recall, in one of Scrooge's dreams, he was shown how everyone was going to rejoice when he died. They had this parade. They danced on his casket. They were so thrilled that they didn't have to put up with such a miserly person who had all that wealth and blessed no one. It was not until he saw into the future in that way that he understood the importance of being a blessing instead of being rich. But to be perfectly honest, we probably won't understand the importance of being a blessing instead of rich until the Lord gets our attention in some way. He may not send to you 3 spirits in your dreams, but he has sent to you Paul's letter to the believers in ancient Corinth. And I hope that you can learn from their mistakes. What is it that stirs your heart? Is there anything? Do you have passion about anything? Is there anything that gets you heated up? Or are you just content? I mean, do you have passion? When you see a need, do you just shut your eyes and go away? Or do you see that need and you actually feel something? You know, God feels things. He gave us emotions so we could feel things. He wants us to use our mind. We need to intellect. He gave us a heart of compassion. Do you feel anything? Because if you feel anything, it's going to impact your behavior. And if God has given you any blessings at all, you're going to use that heat to bless someone by doing something for them. And if you got the passion, but you didn't get to the doing, what's holding you up? What's keeping you from the doing? There are so many needs in the world. There are needs among fellow believers in Christ. There are needs in believers. There are needs in people who don't know the Lord. But if you don't have any passion, just open your eyes and look at the world around you. It's hurting. There are a lot of hurting people. And I hope that the Lord stirs your heart, gives you passion. Because you're in a position like the ancient Corinthians were. You're fluent. You have stuff. Even the poor of us here, who think that we're poor because we're comparing ourselves to each other, are so much more affluent than the rest of the world. If you don't have some passion, and you don't get to the doing of using some of the blessings that you gave to the Lord's word, there's something wrong. Remember the little boy who didn't have much? You probably have more than he had. And you're in a position to be blessed, to be a blessing. We're going to have a hymn of invitation today. And I hope that God stirs your heart to use the resources that he has blessed you with, that you might do something to bless others.